Second thing I will say when it comes to kind of the detailing is look for plosives. So things that you hear like the big p or s type of sounds, right? Those sounds is what we call plosives. So if you're close to the mic, you might have a boom, like a boom boom sound. Depending on your mic, if you don't have the budget for a good mic like a SM58B, which is like what you expect to see at a podcast as a podcast mic, or kind of what I'm using right now, which is more of a condenser mic, it may not be as noticeable. But if you have like a not a very good mic to record off of and doing a podcast, make sure that you when you hear when we're that's kind of where plosives is most obvious and noticeable. So when it comes to dealing with those things, there's a few options to tackle plosives. There's always plugins, or you can very simply find where the plosives is. And if you let's just say you have no budget, so let's just say you don't have enough money to edit your podcast or utilize certain plugins or programs like iZotope to kind of clear out your plosives. There are free options, and I'm pretty sure some of your depending on your DAW, some of them may come with some sort of plosive voice control plugin. But let's just say you don't have anything. A very simple way you can treat plosives is you can either EQ it, so you can just pull up your EQ and just dive it down. But again, you're very limited to what you can do. But I will recommend, let's just say if you have a plosive and you have no budget, you can't spend money on a program or a plugin or whatnot, you can always just find the treble area. So let's just pretend this is our plosive here, and we can turn down the gain so at least it's not as piercing to the ear, and it's like essentially turn down the volume for this particular spot. So make sure when you're doing plosives, I always highly recommend to find those treble areas, cut out a section of it, and just turn down the gain, kind of what we did there, the gain stage right there. So it's less obvious. Yes, you can hear it. You won't be able to hide from it completely, but at least it's not as apparent when it comes to plosives. All right, now we have S sounds. So the sus sounds. Those again too, you can treat them with the gain, kind of what we did with the plosive here. You can do the same thing. You can find the sounds, the S sounds, and then you can just turn down the gain. Find where that is, turn down the gain a little bit, so at least it's less piercing to your ear. All right. So this is assuming if you have no budget to pay for any plugin, use a program like iZotope to clean up the plosives or the audio in general. So those are very simple, easy ways you can clean up your audio so at least it sounds better. All right. So we covered trim, cover plosives, cover the sounds, right? What if you have like a lot of background noise, right? Like fans and stuff like that. So unfortunately, I'll be honest with you, unfortunately, you won't be able to completely clean those up because again, you will need something very specific like iZotope or a very dedicated plugin to target what the extra sounds are coming from. So what I mean by that is, let's just say you're recording in a hall or like a big room, but like with like no furniture in there, no rugs in there and stuff like that. Your background noise will generally be more ringy, more bigger, more vibrant, and that's not necessarily good in terms of audio quality for podcasts. So not saying you can't do it, but generally we want our podcast audio to be dry. So what I mean by that is less reflections. And the less reflections we have, the more kind of direct and more in the face kind of sound quality. But let's just say you can only record it in a hall or something with a lot of reflections. The thing is, you can actually use a few plugins. I know they're for relatively non-expensive. I was using a plugin. I'm not sure if I still have it because I recently switched over to iZotope. Just know that it won't be perfect, but at least if you want kind of more of a drier sound, you can use a plugin to fix it. Our detailing. Another thing I want to say is now we tackle plosives, the sus sounds. So some few things we can do is some light EQing, some light compression. So again, if you don't have a specific audio interface that has a pre-built EQ or compression that you're running your audio through, because most people don't have analog machinery or equipment that you can expect at a studio. So generally, I will recommend adding some post EQ and compression after you cleaned up some of the plosives, the sus sounds, and adjusting those and make sure that your audio is playing well. I recommend having your EQ and compression. Very simple. If I were to give you an example, I'm going to pull my whoopsies. I'm going to pull my track list over here. So what I mean by that is post EQ and compression is always nice to kind of enhance the audio. So let's just say after you trimmed your podcast episode, you cleaned up the whole audio, like plosives. You did your best to tame the plosives, the sus sounds, trying to clean up the background noise, reverbs, and stuff like that. Then we can look into post EQ and compression. So what I mean by that is we have it cleaned up, we're ready. So let's go to the track that we want our EQ. So generally some good areas that you can look into treating your audio a bit more here and making it sound better is using an EQ. So in this case, generally I find that when it comes to podcast type of EQing, we can be a little bit more, I guess, more focused in this sense. So what I mean by that is we can filter out kind of anywhere from 20 to even up to, I'll say up to 60 is a kind of good spot to filter up to. So we have a more concentrated sound. Another thing what we can look into doing, I'm not going to necessarily give you a formula or a exact frequency boost numbers just because it really depends on your quality and your audio. I'm just going to run through what will make more sense and kind of more applicable to you if you were to EQ this. So in most cases, we can always low pass filter, high pass filter in this case, up to 60, just because we don't really need all that noise there. Sometimes depending where you're at, you can even have a filter for the low end here. We can low pass filter as well. So depending what your audio quality is, if you notice there's a lot of, let's just say you're recording in a bigger room, a lot of reverb and stuff, you can generally kind of have a low pass filter here and just pull up our filter as well. So that way it kind of hones in certain frequencies without allowing the other frequencies to come in. So generally kind of up to around like 5K is good enough if you want to do a low pass filter. So those are kind of what I'll say those are normally okay to put onto your podcast audio. So those are like okay for the most part. If you want to add filters, go ahead. I will say the next thing is if you notice if you're recording in kind of like maybe like a smaller room or a very tight room, maybe a closet even sometimes, generally it's worth looking into EQing those frequencies out. So for example, we can actually use a curve here and we can do what's called fishing here. So we zone in, hone in, and narrow down our Q here. And then we just move our frequency spectrum or our little frequency dial here from kind of, I will say even around 200 up to just before the 500, so the 400 here. And you want to look for that really boxy sound. And when you hear that it sounds very boxy at a specific frequency, we just take it out. Another thing what we can do as well is, let's just say the audio or the podcaster's voice, maybe they're lacking a little bit of power or they're not as clear as they should be, because the problem with using podcast audio is that it sounds too dry sometimes. I'll call this the optional frequencies that you can boost. So far we cover kind of like the major ones like filtering, which cuts out a lot of frequencies to dry up the audio a bit more here to make it sound more focused. We also talked about some areas we can take out especially if you're recording in a smaller room. It is worth looking into that 200 to 400 hertz range. So those are the things you can do for EQing in terms of your audio once you finish editing and cleaning that up. The next thing you can do is compression. So very simple. We have our EQ and compression here. Again, that all plays into dynamics. Again, when it comes to compression audio, there's always defaults you can resort to, or you can just kind of DIY, do it yourself, set your own parameters. So when it comes to compressing your audio, it really depends on what we're using it for. I'm kind of for myself personally, when I edit audio, especially when it comes to voice or voiceovers, like vocals or voiceovers, it really depends on what is the context of it. In most cases, you can set the ratio at 4 for audio, like just speaking, or around 2. It won't be as aggressive compression, but at least if you feel like that person's voice is louder in general, or has a pretty good volume with their voice in general, and you don't want to compress the audio too much, kind of around 2 is good, but most of the time you can actually go up to 4, which is a pretty good standard for compressing audio or vocal audio, in this case, voiceover. So that is something we can look into. So around 2 to 4 is pretty good. 4 is pretty common for most things. Yes. Next, we have our attack. Very simple here. How fast do you want it to trigger? Generally, for a podcast sense, there's generally more sudden peaks than like something like playing a piano, I'll say. Just because, again, sometimes your voice may spike all of a sudden. You may be excited for something and all of a sudden it goes up. So this is kind of where I would like to make my compression generally a little bit more sensitive and more reactive. So I set it generally kind of like around the 0.1 as soon as possible and release it as soon as possible. Kind of like around the 200, 300 range is kind of normal. But we want to catch those louds and kind of even it out for the most part. So we have a release here. This is how fast do we want our compression to be let go and reset. So like I said, it really depends. Generally, a good area is 200 to 300. I think it's pretty fair. We don't need it to be too long. Our analysis here, it really doesn't matter that much. Then we get into makeup gain. So this is really important because this allows us to bring back some of the volume that we compressed out. Just because, again, as the name says compression, it's levels out volume, so sometimes it may be a bit too much. So this is where makeup gain is very nice to help bring back some of those volumes. So in this case, we can bring back from 0 to 2 is good enough. Obviously, harder the compression, more volume is squashed out. The lesser compressed it is, less volume is taken out. So in this case, the makeup gain should dictate pretty much how much you want to bring back. And then last but not least, we have our little threshold here. Again, this one is really dependent on how loud the person is or the podcaster is or how quiet they are. So in this case, if you notice you have a really loud co-host or you're loud yourself, maybe worth dialing up our podcast here to make it a little bit more sensitive. Another thing, what makes compression really good as well, especially when it comes to thresholds, this also works reverse. So what I mean by that is if you have someone that's really quiet, we can actually bring our threshold down. And what that does is it takes their lower frequencies and pushes it up now. So in a way, our compressor acts more like two things. It helps control volume, and sometimes it can also help bring up the sound or the voice or whatever you're feeding into your compression here. So those are the things I would recommend that you should definitely do in this detailing phase for your podcast. So again, when it comes to kind of the volume level for adding music to your podcast, this is very subjective, but ultimately you want to get it to a point where it doesn't feel like it's overtaking the podcast audio. So that's one thing I always make sure that it's something that we add in, and when we do these things is that we add in appropriately. So I feel like now the music audio is pretty good, and the same goes with sound effects as well, is that we want to edit and make sure that it fits into the podcast audio. So in this case, I'll pull that up very quickly for you here. So I have an effects here. So sometimes you don't have full control of having the effects exactly kind of on the volume dial here. This is kind of where gain staging is very nice. So as you see, I put this at -14. So originally it's a lot bigger, like something like this. and then it's pretty loud. So I just brought it down to around 17. No, actually it was a 14, right? So it was about 14-ish here.
Yeah, hi, my name's Todd. I've been friends with Derek for several years now. He always ropes me into stuff like this. Gonna embarrass me.
I feel like the audio can come down a bit just because my co-host my guest has a very quieter voice, so I can bring that down a bit. So that's what I mean by kind of mixing it, is that you kind of go around, and when you add sound effects and music, you want to make sure it accompanies the podcasters for that podcast. All right. So that's pretty much it when it comes to podcast editing. So I hope that this was a simple enough tutorial slash, I guess, help out video for those of you that is planning to edit your own podcast. This is something you can absolutely do. Number one, you absolutely do not need to get any programs or any type of plugins if you don't have the budget for this stuff. But if you do later on, I do highly recommend that you at least pick up a few plugins that would be very crucial to helping you clean up your audio. But ultimately, I just showed you how you can edit your podcast just on your DAW. Thank you very much, and I hope to see you all very soon. Bye.